And right now, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dave Cowen and Pierre Lidome to do a demo and talk about some of the contents and the material in the new Forensics 509 Enterprise Cloud Forensics and Incident Response class. Now, there's a lot of interest in this topic and this course, so I'm excited to see what they've got to share today. Dave, Pierre, you guys ready?
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I guess good afternoon for a lot of you. Let's go ahead and get this going. So my name's Dave. If we've never met before, nice to meet you. I am one of the 3 co-authors for the new SANS FOR509 Enterprise Cloud Forensics. This is some things about me, and I'll let Pierre talk as well. Pierre?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Pierre Lidome. I get involved with all kinds of fun stuff with Dave. He started me with the National CCDC Red Team, and one day he said, would you like to write a class for SANS? And so here I am. I helped Dave and Josh write the 509 class.
And so what we're going to be talking about today is kind of what you need to understand about cloud forensics, the new data sources, but also we're going to talk about what we have decided should go into a class if someone wanted to start understanding and doing cloud forensics. And the first thing that I think, this is probably preaching to the choir and a cloud summit, is for people to understand that there are things uniquely different about the cloud, that the kind of the sarcastic and kind of old grumbly antics of, there is no cloud, it's one of those computer. While that may technically be true, there are entirely new features and data sources. There are new capabilities, things that didn't exist without it. So let's just kind of dive into this. Why the emphasis on cloud forensics? SANS has a lot of other forensics classes. We have 4500, 508, we have 398, we have 518. I mean, all these different things. And the reason that we saw a need for a cloud forensics class specifically is because there's so much new data that if you've never dealt with a cloud incident, you wouldn't know where to start. You wouldn't know where the data is. You wouldn't know how to get the data out. You wouldn't know how to correlate the data. You wouldn't know how to understand some of the data. And so we wanted to make sure that we managed to put together, with a day per major cloud, what you need to know to be able to start triaging through and figuring out the whodunit. And so one of the big things that we tell people is that you need to, if you're doing cloud, and almost every company that I'm working with now, unless they have some strange regulatory requirement, is moving to the cloud. I mean, again, this is a cloud summit, you all know this. Scalability, cost, the amazing dynamic nature of being able to bring new resources up and bring up whole new architectures with Terraform at a blink, sometimes slower than that, but a lot faster than you could on premises, means that everyone is just rushing to the cloud, and usually without a really good plan on the security and IR side, which is why you have tools like Jay was just showing that shows kind of how a lot of the popular misconfigured misconceptions have maybe taken us back to some of the earlier days of pen testing, as far as the overly privileged accounts that kind of went away over time on the on-premise environments. And so I like to say that the cloud brings new opportunities, the forgiveness of tech debt past, the revelation of tech debt present, and the acceptance of tech debt future, because we'll always have some amount of tech debt. There's always going to be some decision that we have accepted, or our organization has accepted, that's going to lead to a problem in the future. So for instance, the one developer who was frustrated as they were trying to get a certain on-demand infrastructure running and left that overly privileged role, or associated too many privileges, or the person who picked the template to stand up their Kubernetes cluster from and didn't understand the implied roles that were coming through it and never went back to modify it because it was working. And of course, getting actually all the logs you need online and working. So let's talk about AWS and all the new data sources you can have in here. These are all the things that we talk about in depth in 4509 day 2. So CloudTrail is the major source of data inside of AWS. It's their kind of gigantic audit log where all of the activities from the different API-based services are funneling into. And I think that's really the best way to think about it. If something is happening at the API level, then in general, it's not perfect, but in general, those events should be recorded in CloudTrail. Now, there are newer features that AWS puts out that don't actually get into CloudTrail yet, but then AWS kind of has a backlog of new functionality that they eventually do get into CloudTrail. Things that will surprise you as we go through this is that there are some activities that aren't recorded anywhere, and I'll get to that as we get down the stack. So CloudWatch logs. So CloudWatch logs, and there's, you'll see a lot of this functionality mirrored in other clouds, but there'll be different methodologies and ways to get the data and different ways you have to interpret the data. CloudWatch logs is the way to be able to take logs that are on your endpoints and funnel them up into the AWS CloudWatch log management service. And then from there, you can start building dashboards and metrics. So it could be interesting if you wanted to get all of your sys logs, your event logs, you want to get your web logs all up into one centralized place along with the rest of your cloud data. I'll be honest, most companies that I work with don't do this. They're still centralizing, even if they're multi-cloud, they're centralizing, and they already have some existing infrastructure spend, probably with a Splunk, or maybe they put up a giant elk stack, or maybe they're still using a traditional SIEM, but they're still bringing that data back. It's going to be interesting to see in the future kind of what wins out. AWS is big on marketplace. What I mean by that is they're big about working with vendors, making sure that people understand that there's options. So I think that should be interesting to see how that goes. John McCash says, if you recall, the cloud forensics table tech was presented in one of the sessions a couple years ago. Should we expect that having once been through the class, we'll be equipped to actually navigate the scenario that was presented? Yes, John. I do think that you would have been much better prepared. And in fact, I had a discussion with the Google team who put that on afterwards, and I said, this is what you probably wanted to, have occurred. And they said, well, yeah, that's exactly what we were thinking that you all would do. And they're like, why didn't you do it? And I said, because I was eating a burrito. So let's keep moving down the stack here. So CloudWatch logs insights. So insights in both CloudTrail and CloudWatch logs is Amazon's way of kind of applying pattern recognition. Some might say machine learning. I don't know if it really is, but they definitely will bubble up interesting events from your log so you can kind of understand that there's things you should probably be paying attention to. Now, this is not a SIEM replacement, but it is a thing where Amazon learns from prior incidents and prior things and then comes in and then adds that logic to be able to bubble it up to other customers. So you can see things like brute force attempts or potentially overprivileged accounts or people logging in from new and strange sources. All those kind of things will bubble up there. Guard duty is kind of the next level of that just for CloudTrail. So CloudTrail Insights has kind of small types of things, and it does it for free, well, mainly for free. And it's included with CloudTrail. Guard Duty is kind of that next level that you opt into and pay for, where they do have a full machine learning algorithm that goes through looking for strange trends and things you need to be aware of inside of your CloudTrail logs. If you're looking for NetFlow, that's inside of something called a VPC or Virtual Private Cloud Flow Log. Those are really interesting because it captures standard NetFlow format, but you can also do dynamic network peering. And what I mean by that is an on-premise network, if you wanted to see all the network traffic that was occurring, through that subnet, you would have to go on-premise and put in a tap or reconfigure the switch and make one of the ports a mirror port if you're lucky enough to have something there, and then you have to have something plugged into it. In the cloud, you can literally hit a button and boom, you got NetFlow. You just specify, I want these subnets, I hit the button, boom, NetFlow comes out. If you want to mirror traffic, you don't need a mirror switch port, you need to reconfigure anything. You hit a button, and now it's more than a button with this one because it's not just recording data out to an S3 bucket. You have to do a couple more configuration steps. But without any other architecture and on an on-demand basis, you can turn on and off basically a network tap within your AWS environment. And to me, that's pretty amazing. I think that shows kind of the capabilities that have been added on in addition to the cloud that make the cloud in almost an easier place to do forensics. And then, of course, S3 logs, there's two kinds of S3 logs. We talk about this in the class. There's the S3 logs from the access to the API. So there's an API interface to S3 that gets recorded in CloudTrail. But there's a secondary set of logs for those that are actually accessing S3 through the web interface, the HTTP gateway or HTTPS gateway for S3. And those logs aren't even on by default, and you have to do some work there. They're not even in the same format. It's a bit of a pain, but we'll talk about that in class. Pierre, you want to talk all about Azure AD?
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. So Azure is quite interesting. It's in some ways very similar to AWS and in some ways quite different. Just like Dave mentioned, unfortunately, most logs are not turned on by default. And I know in my day-to-day work, I get called to investigate incidents. And unfortunately, way too often, my incident investigation is cut short simply because logs were not turned on. That being said, Azure is very interesting because Active Directory is now, a certain version of it is now available under the Azure Active Directory, and that's kind of the 400-pound gorilla into IAM. So you can use it in a hybrid mode, and you can also use Azure Active Directory to authenticate over clouds such as AWS and GCP. From there, you will get some very, very rich logs that will show you both primary authentication, like password authentication, as well as secondary authentication for your two-factor. You will use those logs to investigate incidents such as password spray, brute force attacks, a lot of really valuable information in the Azure AD logs. Going down the stack, you have what's usually referred to as platform logs. And those are your audit log of what happened at your tenant level. Did some change get made in a subscription? Did a change get made that affects your entire tenant? And we'll obviously break down in the class the differences between the tenant and the subscription, and which in like GCP, you'd call that your project. We'll go over all the vocabulary, which is a little bit confusing at times. Going down after your audit log, you're looking at your activity logs. And those are really important because that's where you will find your creation, deletion, modification of resources within the Azure cloud. So for instance, in the class, we have a lab where we find a large number of VM creation, and they're not just any kind of VMs, they're VMs that are GPU enabled. And this is a case where someone is building all these VMs in order to do crypto mining. So that's one of our lab, and we use the activity log to find that information. When you go one step further and you have your resources that are running in your cloud, such as your storage, your VMs, your VPC, etc. For each one of these cloud services, you can turn on what's called the diagnostic log, which will allow you to get quite a bit of in-depth information about what that resource is doing. One of the ones I'm playing with right now is the storage log. I'm finding that this is not a log that's turned on by default, and therefore, if someone was to do data exfiltration without that log, it becomes very hard to prove that data got exfiltrated. So that will be one of our lab, again, in this class, where we look at the storage log to either prove or disprove whether data left our tenant. One step that is not shown here, and it's not really a step, it's a in-cloud platform called the Log Analytic Workspace, where you can direct all the logs that I have mentioned so far into that workspace in the cloud. And you don't actually pay for the workspace itself, you pay for the storage consumed by the workspace. And in that workspace, you're able to do, you use what's called a KQL, Custo Query Language, and you can do quite a bit of a rich searches inside of your logs. The network watcher is built onto that analytic workspace specifically for your VPC flow logs in order to analyze your network traffic. Now you can obviously take all these logs and, as Dave said, export them to a SIEM such as Splunk. Or if you wanted to stay within the Azure ecosystem, you could stay in the Azure Sentinel, which is the SIEM/SOAR built by Microsoft. We will not really spend time on Sentinel because we don't want to turn this into an advertisement for Microsoft, but rather we will export all our logs into a SIEM, in this case, Soft Elk, which is more typical of what a big enterprise would be doing. And that also gives us a uniform way to look at both AWS, Azure, and GCP log during the class. Dave, back over to you for GCP.
Great. And for those who are wondering, that's interesting. Dave's passing Azure stuff off to Pierre. Well, in SANS, when we work together to create a course, we own different days to make sure that we get everything written correctly and kind of own the content. So I'm the AWS person, the soon-to-be Day 6 challenge person. Pierre is the Azure and Office 365 expert. And then Josh, who is asleep right now because he's in Australia, is our GCP and G Suite master. But let's talk about some GCP data sources. I can talk in Josh's place. GCP has a lot of these similar things. So you're going to have cloud audit events, admin events, data access events, all of these of what's changing with the GCP environment, things that are happening at a API level. And I think that's a good way to think about it. The API level, the hypervisor level, as things are being requested and changed, that gets captured. VPC flow logs. Now, what's funny about VPC flow logs inside of GCP is that it doesn't actually capture all traffic. It's a sampling. So interesting, right? Interesting how every vendor is a little different how they choose your implementation. So you will have to do a full mirror if you wanted to get a full set of NetFlow out of GCP. GCP also have firewall logs. They get written out just like all the rest of them do. And then StackDriver is the logging platform. The log API built on top of that is kind of how all of the log data is unified and then written out to the admin activity stream. But GCP is definitely, of the three, kind of, as you'll see, written for developers, very developer focused, has a lot of interesting nuances to it. And in some ways, a lot of the functionality that's much more stable inside of Azure and AWS is in beta or constantly changing in GCP. So it's definitely a bit of a challenge, but still some really interesting and innovative things you can do there as well, especially if you pay attention to all the tools that the Google IR team keeps putting out to help. Pierre, there's a question for you here from Pankaj. How is Azure Audit Log different from activity logs?
If I unmute myself, that would work better. So the audit log are at the higher level. They're really changes to your tenant itself, as opposed to, I'm sorry, what was the rest of the question? The audit log versus
the audit logs versus the activity logs. What's the difference?
Yes, so the activity logs would be one level below the tenant. More like what's happening at your subscription level. So I changed permission to the subscription. I added someone in the subscription, as opposed to I made a change that's tenant-wide.
Yeah, and if that doesn't make sense to you, we will explain it in class. They say he thinks a lot.
Yeah, sure. And I see the second question about the storage log. So the storage log, and that is one really big challenge in Azure, is you actually have to go to your storage account and turn on the diagnostic setting on your storage account. This is something I'm actually struggling a little bit in my company because we have over 4,000 storage accounts. So I actually have a ticket open with Microsoft right now on how to be able to build a policy around turning diagnostic settings for all 4,000 accounts past and then in the future without doing it manually. There's still a lot of, in all of these clouds, a lot of growing pains. So it's quite a challenge.
Yeah, and John, to your point, we do say what clouds logs are on by default, which ones you have to enable. But if you do enable them, we want to make sure you understand how you can analyze the results. Yeah. Andy, you asked a good question. Can you repeat the SEM used in the course? So Andy, we're using SoftElk, and I think this is going to be a great use to the community. We worked with the SoftElk team to actually get Logstash parsers made for all of the clouds. So there is now Logstash configs that come with the VM for the class that lets you ingest CloudTrail, S3, Azure, GCP, and NetFlow across all the entities up and into anything that you can point Logstash to. And the big reason we use SoftElk is we wanted to make sure that we had something that the students could use, maintain, and we didn't have to worry about cloud providers changing things and breaking things in the middle of class. So we have all of the great raw data that you need, and we're going to be able to do some neat visualizations and correlations to help you figure out how to interpret and understand it.
And Microsoft 365 Logstash, which that one was a big challenge.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So we actually have Logstash rules written for all of those data sources now. So it's definitely something that you can take directly from the class being over and come in and stand that up anywhere else you want. Arturo says a deploy if not exist policy would be useful for you to set Azure storage diagnostic settings and stay away from the classic diag settings.
Yep.
Well, yeah.
I totally agree.
Thanks, Arturo. So embrace the cloud infrastructure. This is kind of something, if you need help kind of discussing this with on-prem teams, we made this kind of set of shortcuts of ways to compare and understand the similarity. So your on-prem firewall, you can think of that like a virtual firewall appliance or a network security group set of rules. You're talking about network monitoring. On-premise, you have NetFlow and network taps and IDS and IPS. In the cloud, you have VPC flow logs. You can do virtual taps. I think one of the questions pointed out that you can actually now in AWS get PCAPs recorded directly from your VPC config screen and out to S3, which is amazing if you think about that. But again, some of the providers are getting more with other vendors to create kind of IDS, IPS solutions that work in the cloud that are kind of cloud native, kind of deployable templates to push it up there. Amazon's gone really far with that. Microsoft has that, but they're also going kind of first tier with their Sentinel platform. And Google's also starting to build out some functionality there as long as they have Chronicle, right? You can just ingest everything into Chronicle with Google. For authentication sources, on premise, you have SSO and Active Directory. In the cloud, a lot of people are moving to Azure AD, especially hybrid ADFS. I see that more and more and more across my clients. You should definitely be aware of that. You're going to want to have an understanding of what those logs mean, because you are going to be looking at them and they could mean a lot of things, and then starting to learn the difference between an Azure AD authenticated account versus a service principal named account versus an on-prem authentication that got replicated up. So it gets interesting. Amazon has their own version of an IAM platform, as well as Google has both Cloud IAM and Workspace. So there is a lot of options here and places where people could be making decisions. It's going to determine where you could see those authentications. So when we start talking about log storage, you can see that you can build it on-premise. I say on-premise, you could run these in the cloud as well. So you could do a Splunk, an Elk, or a SIM on-premise. In the cloud, each provider is kind of building out their own sets for log storage and alerting. So in AWS, I put CloudWatch Logs Insights. That's probably a little too specific. Obviously, anything involving CloudWatch, and CloudTrail together, those things feeding up to AWS Detective would work. Azure Sentinel is definitely the kind of the choice there. In GCP, I said StackDriver before because you can import all the logs in StackDriver. That really has been superseded by Google's Security Command Center. The one thing that I want to make sure you're also aware of, for those of you who are running into growing pains with Elk, is that both Azure and AWS, and I'm sure if not already, but maybe not, because Google also has BigQuery available to you, but Azure and AWS now have a auto-scaling Elk stack. In other words, you can actually configure the parameters, and then they will, on demand, like in any other type of auto-scaling group, actually scale up an Elk stack for you to be able to auto scale and add more nodes and add more storage as you keep ingesting data. And we've used this now on a couple of projects on large incidents. And I can tell you that we have gotten 37 terabytes of data loaded into an auto scaling Elk group in AWS, and it works like a champ. And the backend support people there are amazing at helping you really tweak the low end sides of Elk to get maximum effect. So, Splunk, obviously, the premium choice product, but with the premium attached. And so that's why a lot of people are looking and are trying to understand, like, okay, what do I really want to load in Splunk versus what do I want to store in other places? And then, of course, one thing that we didn't talk about here is Athena. And then AWS and Azure, you have log analytics, and GCP, you have Log Explorer, so you do have ways to search, but this was more about overall aggregation. So different levels of maturity in the cloud for sure. In Azure, you're talking about, you used to, in old Resource Manager V1, be talking just about creating snapshots and downloading VHDs. Pierre, tell everyone about the future.
Well, in the future, we have a lot of neat things we can do. We still use snapshots, but we're able to simply create a VM, mount those snapshots, so no more downloading of VHDs. The suggestion is you create your forensic VM in the cloud, in Azure, mount that snapshot, and you run your tools such as Scape or what TZWorks or whatever tool you're used to. And that way, at most, what you would do is download your results back to your machine. But given that all the cloud providers charge you for egress traffic, the less you have to download, the better it is. And also you can scale much easier. You can also perform your investigation anywhere in the world. Nowadays with GDPR and all kinds of data residency requirements across the world, it's really nice to be able to sit at your keyboard wherever you are and simply bring up a VM instance, put your virtual your forensic tool on that instance and do your work. You no longer have to try to procure any kind of hardware to do that. And obviously, if you are in a situation where you want to leverage, maybe just for one project or one incident, in cloud type capabilities, something like Sentinel will give you an amazing wealth of tools. Another thing we do go over the class briefly is the Event Hub, is the ability to stream logs in real time to that Event Hub and then write your own code against the Event Hub to pull those logs and do what you want to do. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do with the storage log, because within the storage log, there's actually one and only one operation that I'm interested in, which is the get blob operation. I want to know when someone is downloading data in order to look for data exfiltration. And that way I can stream this data, grab the event I'm interested in, and discard everything, therefore saving me a lot of resources and money. So a lot of neat capabilities.
Yeah, and I think the overarching message you're going to hear us say, both in public and as well as in class, is that while we do understand why you'd want to bring cloud logs out of the cloud just so you can get them centralized across your different resources and have better alerting, when it comes to actually doing triage and forensics on endpoints, we highly recommend that you do that in the cloud for speed, for access, and for automation purposes. And there's a lot we'll talk about there. So GCP, so it used to be that you would be basically mounting one snapshot within another tenant and then creating an image and then just doing syslog forwarding. But there's so much now that you can do. So you can use GCP's built-in agent to actually push out live triage now. So you can actually have it and then dump back to a storage account somewhere or push it up via Logstash and without having any prior configuration or authentication, be able to do that dynamically across your GCP environment. And then of course, all of the neat tools that the Google IR team are putting out, like TimeWolf and Turbinia and those things work together, you can really start pushing through that triage data. And if you wanted to live in strictly a Google-centric world, you could do that pretty great. Let's see, this may be too big to answer effectively, but do you have a reference or recommendation on a list of known default or recommended cloud logging settings? John, that is a good question. The answer is no. And this is probably one of the guardrails in the class, is that we've tried to focus on log interpretation and where to go and get the data because it's so much to do. But this is not an architecture class. We're not going to be going through talking about large amounts of configuration. And then, of course, in AWS, the old ways include snapshotting AMIs and delving disks, but now you can do full automation flows with step functions and lambdas to be able to go from a CloudWatch log event all the way to a snapshot being created, data being ingested with a lambda function, data being processed out into an EFS or S3 bucket, and then container instance being spun up to do automation. There's so much you can do. It's amazing. It really is. Let's talk about log storage in the cloud pretty quickly. Pierre, want to talk about Azure?
Yeah, so in Azure, we use storage containers and blobs. really the cost, you can store as much or as little as you want. The cost is whatever the storage cost is. You have various choices between hard drive and solid state drive and premium solid state. So it's really whatever you want. A lot of these diagnostic settings do provide the ability to have retention. So you could say, I only want to keep for a short period of time and then I'll export it. But the one thing that unfortunately is missing in Azure is the AWS concept of like Glacier, where you can have a really long-term retention for very cheap. That's not really available. But otherwise, you store as you need. Not a problem. They can support very, very large amount of storage.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a big thing there, is that you can store as long as you want and as much as you want. It's a question of cost at that point. And you can quickly either overwhelm yourself in cost, but you can also get rid of the problem you had before of, I'm running out of logs and there's no way I can get storage in time. James Butler says, can you talk about commercial products in the cloud, like in-case, FTK, net analysis? You could absolutely do that. And we do that inside of pre-configured forensic VMs that we basically have on hot standby and put into different cloud regions so that we're always close to the data and wherever the snapshot is, because there is a data transfer cost involved moving between regions, and there's delays and speed. So we do stand those up inside of VM. So we don't talk about those tools directly in class because nothing really changes in using those tools. The endpoint analysis is still the same. We really do focus on what's unique and new, strictly within the new cloud data sources.
David,
John Stewart, oh yeah, go ahead.
Quick comment of FTK. So I stood up a full FTK lab in the cloud, and it obviously works, but it's not natively designed for that. And so it used a lot of resources, putting SQL in there and putting all your database. It doesn't use the cloud native SQL. And honestly, it can be done, no question about it. It was not the best way to do our work, is what I found.
John Stewart says, what's the state of the legal world related to forensics being done excluding the cloud? Things like chain of custody and legal holds. John, I think it's actually easier. And the reason that I say that is that you can mark volumes read-only. You can mark S3 buckets for incremental changes, but read-only access. You have full audit logging to who's accessing the data, and you can segment that to just certain groups. I'm not seeing any issues there. In fact, there's one very large case we're working on now where a locked down, fully audited S3 bucket has become our record for legal hold going forward. We're just dumping the data there, and we have full transparency, accountability across what's happening. We have read-only storage, and we don't have to worry about storage failing based upon how we're paying for it long term. Now, obviously, if it were to stretch on for years, maybe the client would want us to put that onto some kind of long-term archival media where they only have to pay once. But it really does work, and if you understand how to configure the audit logging, configure the security permissions correctly, and set up your bucket right, it'll do you just fine. I don't see any issue. And then if you wanted to, you being John Stewart, you could automate a solution so that as things get placed in there, you could have an automation Lambda trigger and that's an AWS, a cloud function in Azure, or anything else. The names change, the functionality is the same, but you could have a trigger when things hit that bucket. You could actually generate a chain of custody entry inside of your database.
And don't forget snapshots, Dave. I mean, the ability to do, at least in Azure, you can do full snapshot, which are point-in-time copies, similar to what you would do with a disk duplicator. You can also do incremental snapshots, and you can have those triggers on a schedule. So you can certainly make quite a few copies to document what you're doing.
Yeah, Edwin asked a good question. Keeping in mind the cost of exporting data from each cloud provider, what's the best way to export reducing costs? Edwin, that's a great question. The answer is you actually put together a cloud function, so some type of serverless function in front of your logs so that you're only actually exporting a subset of logs that you're prepared to ingest rather than all of the logs that may be stored that are going to be stored regardless. Like for instance, in GCP, your account audit logs are going to go back 400 days. In AWS, by default, CloudTrail for free will go back for 90 days. In Azure, it's 30 days. So that's going to be there no matter what. And you can go back and pull that data when you want to. But the subset of those events and those data sources that you actually have rules and alerting logic for, you could write a serverless function to basically take and extract those parts of the logs and then ship them back. In fact, that's a big thing for Google when they talk about pushing things out that they recommend that you do. There's an automated way to do that within their web UI to pick what you want forwarded out. And that way you can get the data that you need without incurring the cost of all the data that exists. Now, if it's not a problem for you and you want to have the whole thing pushed out, you could just forward the whole log source. It's not an issue. So StackDriver, here's their costs. For AWS, this is for logs being shipped out to S3 from VPC and Route 53, as well as CloudWatch logs. There's some other S3 pricing for long-term storage. I didn't include that here. This is really about logs. But I think the big thing here is understand that the prices are comparable to investing into server-side architecture as far as large storage arrays goes, but you don't have to worry about the ongoing maintenance and availability and being there at 2 a.m. when the RAID fails and all the other fun stuff. Plus, you get to add on additional things like read-only abilities and full audit access and logging and everything, being basically shoved into a kind of an IR security-only account that other people can't touch. So, do you need agents anymore? Well, I mean, the answer is yes, but let's talk about some of the agents that are actually built in now that maybe make your life a little easier if you don't have an endpoint agent deployed. Pierre?
Yeah, so Azure agents are a bit in a state of flux. There's some that are meant more for, actually most of them are meant more for performance monitoring. However, there is one that we use called the diagnostic agent, which will give us the Windows or Unix log. And that's, to me, is pretty neat, is the ability to get the Windows event log or the syslog and surface them at the cloud level so that you can compare, say, your IAM, your Azure AD logging information with your system logging information. Like I said, there's a bit of a state of flux in the Azure world with the agent. The one we use is the diagnostic agent. There is one called the monitoring agent, which Microsoft has said they eventually kind of plan to make it the universal agent for everything, but it's not there yet. So for our purpose, the Windows or Linux diagnostic agent is what we'll cover in class to show you how to get those logs.
Yep. So good question. Can you talk about Cloud IR as a career? What demand is in there? What certifications are recommended? What companies specialize in it? And how to get started? So this is a great question. This is really kind of the beginning stages of really serious Cloud IR focused roles. I mean, I know that we have both a cloud security team, and then within my team at KPMG, we have people that are specializing in cloud as far as cloud incident response, but we still expect some kind of cross domain knowledge, because we still have to be able to analyze the cloud plus to be able to analyze the endpoints. I know several other organizations out there that are looking specifically just for cloud focused people. A lot of them want them to either be cross-skilled to be cloud security as well as cloud IR, if they're going to be focusing just on the cloud, or like my group, they would like a cross-section between traditional IR and cloud IR to be able to answer both. But the demand is huge, right? I mean, this is all of these companies, organizations, agencies, governments have moved up into the cloud, and not enough people know what they're doing as far as how to deal with all the data sources that exist and how to be able to set up good automations. Everyone is we're talking to clients now, and everyone is kind of in one of three states. They're either planning to move to the cloud, and they're being told that they don't have a choice in it, and so they're trying to figure out how to deal with it. So that's one. We have other ones that have already moved to the cloud or found out that the developers moved to the cloud without telling them. That's very common. And suddenly they're having to deal with it. And so we're helping them kind of get initial maturity built up and making some plans. And then we have others that are in the cloud. They have their initial states, and now we're kind of helping them kind of level up to get that automations to live their best lives. Pierre says, sorry, not Pierre. Pierre, a question for you from Sagar. Is IR in Azure handled by Sentinel? How about evidence handling in case of Azure?
So Sentinel is a SOAR/SIEM that's built into Azure. I've used it a little bit, but not a whole lot, because at my company, we do export all the logs. since we use we not only we use the 3 clouds mentioned here, but we actually use 3 other clouds. So we have 6 different clouds. So we don't we only use Sentinel for a few projects. It's a neat tool. I mean, when I've played with it, it does a lot of great things, but it's not the focus of the class. Again, we don't want to be here to advertise any specific vendor's product.
And to be specific, Sagar, about Azure Sentinel, you basically have to use functions in order to do automations based upon Azure Sentinel alerts. So it is something that we've set up and done for some of our clients, but that's the big thing. And then evidence handling in the case of Azure, it's the same thing. You put it into a storage account and then you configure it correctly and monitor it. All right, so we talked about the Azure agents or GCP agents as well. GCP agents are actually pretty neat because now there's 2 levels of agent, and then one of them actually ship logs back to GCP, so you can get, on demand within investigation. You can suddenly enable that and start having your endpoint syslogs and web logs and event logs kind of funneling back into one central source if you didn't have that done already. So that part's useful, but it's still not a traditional, MDR, XDR platform. Same with AWS. You do have to make sure the SSM agent is installed, but you can absolutely do a lot of triage, data collection, as well as running scripts, as well as they have some kind of generic monitoring agent that would allow you to collect metrics and looking for odd things occurring, like CPU spiking and new instances being started up is usually a good indicator that someone's streaming your cloud into a Bitcoin mining farm. We're quickly running out of time. So one thing that we will talk about is container forensics. And for those who are living and trying to figure out how to do container forensics right now, the 2 things I would tell you is, one, if you're looking for visibility within the container environment, there are solutions out there. The one that's for free that works really well for this is OS Query, that can absolutely get through Kubernetes and Docker and be able to pull back from central space and then feed back that data into something like a Splunk or any other SIM that you want to be able to start getting that type of visibility inside of that environment. Because if not, you may be surprised in a nasty way in the future when JBL shows up inside of your org. Pierre, you want to talk about Office 365 real quick?
Yes, so formerly known as Office 365, and we still make the mistake of calling it that. It's really Microsoft 365 now. Unfortunately, that's something we'll find a lot in the cloud. Naming convention change a lot. No sooner we finished and published the first beta of the class, the logo for Azure already changed, but it doesn't change the work we have to do. So Microsoft 365 has this concept of a universal audit log, which records a lot of information, which is great. Here we say it does not record individual mail item access. That's actually only partially correct. It's very much depends on which license level you have. So that's something that you will find in a SaaS product, that the license level you may have may change the functionality that you get from a logging perspective. So if you have an E5 license, you will get individual email access information. If you only have E3, you will not. Or it also depends on the client that you use. So a lot of depends that will cover in class and show you what can be done.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of rushing ahead here because technically we have 2 minutes. So what do we do with AWS? So there's 4 days right now in the current version of 509, which we go first beta of next week. I know, John, you'll be there. And so on the first day, we go through talking about how to understand cloud data sources available on a cloud based upon the type of cloud that it is. And then we go straight into Microsoft 365. And then on day 2, we go through talking about AWS, going through with labs all about CloudTrail and VPC flow logs and tracking lateral movement and everything else kind of around that. And then in Azure, we do an Azure focus set of labs, making sure that you understand all the data sources and where they exist and how to interpret the logs and how to do analysis. We do the same thing in GCP. And then when we were talking about the full 6-day class, it'll be coming out in the probably beginning of 22. we're going to be adding on 2 additional days. So one day is going to be all about like G Suite and Google Workspace, and then we're evaluating which of the other SaaS vendors is worth doing. And then a day 6 multi-cloud IR challenge that we think is really going to help you kind of open your eyes to what's possible and how to deal with incidents at that scope and level. Jefferson says, could you share these slides as well? I'll see if we can, Jefferson. Beth said, why did you combine all 3 cloud providers into one class? I think for most people, at least one day, maybe 2 is not needed because I don't know any companies using all 3 clouds at the same time. Beth, the majority of companies I know now are using at least 2. A lot of people are using Azure for AD, authentication, ADFS, and Office 365, but then they're using AWS or GCP for compute. So I do see more and more companies that are multi-cloud and more going that way. And the reason we provided all of them into one class is because we needed to have a starting point. So if you ever notice how SANS does things, they'll start with one class that combines a lot of topics. And then as that class kind of grows in information and depth and scope and people make requests, it eventually then splits out into additional classes. So in the future, I could see that we have kind of advanced AWS incident response class that goes deeper in depth and covers things like more configuration, more automation, more in-cloud exercises. Same thing for Azure, same things for GCP. But there's so much need and demand, Beth, we want to make sure that we created a class that covers everyone's kind of immediate needs for what they're doing. So that's what we have for you today. I know our time is up.